On February 1st, 1979, Sid Vicious was released on bail. The next morning, he was dead from a heroin overdose. No one knows who gave him that final injection. Just 3 months earlier, his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen, had been found dead from a single stab wound in room 100 of the Chelsea Hotel. Sid was lying right beside her, unconscious. He was charged with murder. But that knife might not have been his. And more than one witness claimed they saw a man leaving the room before the police arrived. Between the two deaths lay a chain of strange events, shifting testimonies, missing evidence, and secret meetings no one would admit to. Sid had once been the rebellious face of punk rock. But in the end, he left this world forgotten, surrounded by questions that have never been answered. If Nancy didn't die by Sid's hand, then who killed her? And if Sid didn't take his own life, then who is truly responsible for his death? Chapter 1, Being Thrown Out at 16, changed Sid's life. It was the last time they would call each other mother and son. The sharp click of a lighter broke the silence in the darkened room. A small flame lit up Anne's thin, pale face. Cigarette smoke curled in the dim glow of an old desk lamp. Outside the window, rain tapped steadily against the tin roof, blending with the sound of wind seeping through the cracks. She stood in the middle of the room, cigarette in hand, her voice rough and cold. Either you go, or I go, and I'm not going. Sid stood still, his shoulders hunched. Where am I supposed to go? He asked quietly, almost as if he was talking to himself. Anne took a slow drag, exhaling smoke without looking at him. I don't care. That moment was only the breaking point of a bond frayed long ago. To understand it, you have to go back to his earliest years. Simon John Ritchie was born in London in May of 1957. His father walked out when he was still an infant. When Sid was just a few years old, Anne found a glimmer of hope in a soldier named Christopher Beverley. The wedding was simple: a crisp military uniform, a wedding photo hanging slightly crooked on a small wall, a table with only a few dishes but filled with laughter. 6 months later, Christopher died from kidney disease. The house fell silent again. In the years that followed, Anne slowly sank into the things that helped her forget reality. Work came and went, money ran dry, and every night the apartment was thick with the smell of cheap cigarettes, the hiss of an old radio in the corner. A friend once recalled seeing Sid sitting alone on the front step, holding a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. No one knew what was written on it, and he never spoke of it. It was never confirmed, but the image stayed with them. The night he was thrown out, Sid carried a plastic bag with a few worn clothes, a tattered magazine, and a steel comb. The rain kept falling. The thud of his rubber shoes on the wet pavement felt heavy. Under the dim, yellow glow of the streetlights, his shadow merged with the muddy puddles. He found his way to squats, places where the walls seemed to hold the smell of sleepless nights. At Kingsway College, Sid fell in with 3 other young men. They called themselves the Four Johns. By day, they roamed the streets of Camden. By night, they slept shoulder to shoulder on cold wooden floors, living off scraps and the occasional free gig at a small bar. People said the streets meant freedom, but that freedom could lead through doors that opened only downward. Sid's figure faded into the dark street, his hand still gripping that crumpled piece of paper. No one knew where he was headed, only that the road would take him to far more dangerous places. Chapter 2. Was Sid Vicious just a pawn named the Sex Pistols? The audience that night thought they were watching a punk rock show. But what they were really witnessing felt more like a carefully staged performance. On the small stage at the screen on the green, the electric guitar screeched, mixing with the smell of spilled beer on the wooden floor and thick cigarette smoke. Sid stood in the glare of the spotlight, dark circles under his eyes, plucking at his bass strings awkwardly. On his left arm, a stark white bandage wrapped tightly, so noticeable it was hard to look away. A reminder that his body carried not just wounds, but secrets. From the crowd came whistles of mockery, broken by a few quiet laughs. Sid only smirked, turning his back to the audience as if their contempt was just another part of the act. Few knew that just months earlier, he had never stood on a major stage. In the dim, smoke-filled clubs of Camden, where yellow light fell on peeling walls, Sid had become an unforgettable face, not for his playing, but for his aggression. One winter night, through a haze of smoke and pounding music, he pulled a motorcycle chain from his jacket and struck music critic Nick Kent on the head. Another time, in a crowded pub, he hurled a pint glass toward the stage. It shattered, shards catching the light before vanishing into the crowd, leaving behind the scream of a young woman who lost sight in one eye. By early 1977, the Sex Pistols had parted ways with bassist Glenn Matlock. Malcolm McLaren, the band's manager, wasn't just looking for a musician. He wanted someone who could stir the press. Steve Jones recalled that the day a newspaper reported Sid's latest brawl, Malcolm sat in a small cafe near Soho, tapping the table, staring at the headline and grinning. Not a loud laugh, just the quiet, satisfied smile of someone who had just spotted a new piece on the chessboard. When Never Mind the Bollocks entered recording, Sid was in a hospital bed with hepatitis, the result of dirty needles. Steve ended up playing most of the bass parts. Yet in the promo photos, Sid stood front and center, black leather jacket, defiant eyes, that white bandage on his arm, now part of the Vicious brand. A record label employee recalled one interview. Before the cameras rolled, Malcolm leaned in and whispered something in Sid's ear. Seconds later, Sid sprang up, slammed the table, and cursed directly at the journalist. The next morning, the story was splashed across the front page. Just as he wanted, the employee said. Sid had done his part, and Malcolm had his headline. On stage, Sid was hailed as the embodiment of punk, raw, defiant, unbound by rules. But beyond the lights were chills, trembling nights without a fix, and the quiet sense of being steered by unseen hands. That white bandage would eventually come off, but it could never erase the marks beneath. Just as, when a pawn is no longer useful, it can only fall from the board, quietly, and with no one there to pick it up. Chapter 3. Nancy Spungen. Love or a lifelong destruction. The first night they met wasn't a romantic moment. It felt more like a warning. Some whispered that Nancy Spungen had been thrown out of several London hotels in less than a week for causing trouble. Yet that night, she still appeared, standing in the corner of the hotel lounge where the band was gathered. Cigarette smoke so thick, it dimmed the yellow bulb hanging overhead. Sid sat in a chair, the white bandage still wrapped tightly around his arm, a mark from a dirty needle. He fidgeted with a crumpled piece of paper in his pocket, its contents known to no one. Then his eyes found Nancy. Blonde hair, red lips, a half-burned cigarette between her fingers, and a gaze that lingered longer than politeness allowed. Nancy was from New York, her voice quick and sharp as a blade. Some claimed she had worked as a call girl. Others said she was a groupie, who knew exactly how to pick her targets. Through all the rumors, she walked straight to Sid, and with just a single hello, the space between them seemed to vanish. From then on, they were inseparable, not only in hurried embraces in hotel hallways, but in the darker rituals they shared. Heroin crept into every morning. Sleepless nights blurred together, hallway lights flickering as muffled arguments seeped from behind locked doors. One fellow hotel guest recalled, "You couldn't be near them without being drawn in." But once the door closed, no one knew what went on. Some said Sid once stood by as Nancy cut into her own arm, blood spilling onto the floor, as some twisted test of love. Others insisted he encouraged her to push further. None of it was confirmed, and no one dared to ask. Malcolm McLaren saw Nancy as trouble. He even discussed ways to send her back to America. But Sid wouldn't let her go. At every show, she stood just off stage, her eyes fixed on him, as if the whole crowd was nothing more than a backdrop. One night in a club, the music pounded from the speakers, lights flashing blue and red, the smell of spilled beer mixing with sweat. Nancy leaned in and whispered something in Sid's ear. He burst out laughing, but seconds later, the laughter turned into a punch against the brick wall. The dry crack of impact, the sound of breaking glass at his feet, and blood dripping from his knuckles onto the floor. A witness swore that stain stayed there for days. Nancy was like a flame, bright, fierce, and beautiful. But stand too close for too long, and you burn with her. And the question still hangs. In Nancy, did Sid find salvation or a one-way ticket to the edge? Chapter 4. Nancy's death and the accusation hanging over Sid. It was a morning unlike any other at the Chelsea Hotel. Usually, the 7th floor hallway carried faint traces of clumsy guitar chords, the smell of cheap coffee mingling with hand-rolled cigarettes, and the quiet click of doors opening as someone stepped out in search of sunlight. But that day, everything was silent, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to be revealed. A little after 8 o'clock, the desk clerk knocked on the door of room 100. He called Nancy's name, then Sid's. No answer. 3 knocks later, the lock turned slowly. The door opened, just enough for the pale morning light to spill into the dark room. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of blood, mixed with stale cigarette smoke and the sharp tang of liquor left standing too long. In the bathroom, Nancy Spungen lay on her back on the cold tile floor, a deep crimson pool spreading from a single stab wound to her abdomen. Sid sat motionless on the edge of the bed. His eyes were sunken, his skin drained of color. The white bandage on his arm had come loose, hanging by a thread. On the table, amid empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and a bottle of spilled sleeping pills, a crumpled piece of paper remained exactly where it was. They said the night before, room 100 stayed lit until morning. Cigarette smoke hung so thick, it turned every figure into a blur. Sid had swallowed more than 30 Tunal pills before collapsing onto the bed, barely conscious. The door was left unlocked. Nancy, in a thin nightgown, sat curled up in a chair, speaking quietly to a few unfamiliar faces. Small paper packets passed from hand to hand. A bottle cap popped. The faint clink of metal. Sometime after midnight, shouting erupted, followed by the sound of furniture hitting the floor. A musician in the next room recalled, "I heard things breaking, but no one went in." Or maybe no one wanted to. A witness on the floor below swore they saw a man in a dark coat leaving the room, hands shoved deep in his pockets. His face was hidden by shadow. If that man existed, why was he never found? And why, the next morning, were several $1,000s missing from the room without a trace? The hallway outside, room 100, still flickered with unsteady light. The old bulb seemed ready to die, flashing in uneven bursts. Each time it lit, the shadow of someone standing close to the door appeared on the wall. Each time it dimmed, the shadow vanished. No one knew if it was real, or just a trick of the light. When the police arrived, there were no sirens, no shouting. Only the heavy footsteps of 2 officers and the soft rustle of paper as they took notes. Sid was led away, head bowed, his hand still gripping that crumpled piece of paper inside the pocket of his leather jacket. The once white bandage on his arm was now gray with dirt. He disappeared down the end of the hallway, while behind him, the bathroom floor still held the dark outline of blood. At the Chelsea, it wasn't the first time an artist had left in the shadows, but never before had a shadow left behind so many questions. And for Sid, the darkest days had only just begun. Chapter 5. Sid's final, unsettling days. Sid was taken out of the Chelsea Hotel not as a punk icon, but as a shadow being led between 2 lines of police officers. No cheers, no one waiting. Only a few photographers snapping shots that would make the next day's front pages. Through the camera lenses, his eyes looked hollow, yet as if still clinging to something only he knew. On his first day at Rikers Island, Sid said nothing. He asked for nothing except methadone to ease the withdrawal. The cell was small, the walls stained, the dampness clinging to his clothes. Old friends said that ever since the night Nancy died, he hadn't been the same. The only answer he ever gave when asked, "What happened?" was, "I don't remember." A volunteer lawyer took on his case, but each time they met, Sid was holding that same crumpled piece of paper. No one knew if anything was written inside, or if it was blank. Some guessed it was an unfinished lyric. Others believed it was a few lines Nancy had written to him on their final night. Outside, the media turned the case into spectacle. Nancy's blood-stained image splashed across tabloids. One magazine ran the headline, "Punk Love Story Turned Murder Mystery." Fans split into two camps, those convinced Sid had killed Nancy, and those certain he had been set up. Neither side knew the truth, and perhaps neither wanted to. When he was released on bail, paid by his former record label, Sid walked out thinner, his gaze still clouded. He went back to heroin. This time, the doses were stronger. The apartment where he stayed became a gathering spot for friends, music, needles, and endless sleepless nights. Outside the window, the New York sky hung gray and heavy. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of long nights no one survived sober. A friend later described the last party. Sid wore a leather jacket over a torn t-shirt. He laughed, hugged people, even strummed a few chords on a guitar. But every so often, his hand would slip into his pocket to make sure that crumpled piece of paper was still there. Near midnight, he said, he was going to get a good night's sleep. The next morning, Sid was found motionless in bed. Beside him, a used syringe and traces of white powder on a plate. No one knew if he had injected himself or if someone else had done it for him. His mother came in, stood silently by the bed for a long time, then took the paper from his hand. She slipped it into her pocket and never spoke of it again. And the strangest part? Someone who had been in the apartment that night swore they saw another figure leave at dawn. Not a friend, not family. If that was true, why had it never been investigated? Sid was gone at the age of 21, but the story didn't end there, because only days later, a startling revelation would emerge, making everything more tangled than ever. Chapter 6: The Controversial Death. Only 3 days after Sid's death, a middle-aged man walked into a small bar in the Lower East Side. He downed a glass of whiskey in one gulp, then told anyone willing to listen that he knew the truth about the Chelsea Hotel. No one recorded his name, but fragments of his story still remain, scattered, vague, and riddled with contradictions. According to what was said, Nancy hadn't been with Sid alone that night. There had been at least one other person, and a heated argument broke out over money. In the chaos, Sid supposedly left the room and wandered down to the lobby. If that detail was true, it could change the entire case. But why was it never investigated? Did the police simply choose the easiest path, pinning all the blame on a famous addict? The crumpled piece of paper, clutched in Sid's hand until his final breath, was now in his mother's possession. Some claimed she once showed it to a friend, revealing only a few hastily written words. "We had a plan. Wait for me." But that friend never produced proof, and she never confirmed it. Sid's funeral was anything but quiet. A group of friends in leather jackets, safety pins glinting, blasted Sex Pistols music right there in the cemetery. To the distorted howl of guitar, they scattered part of his ashes over Nancy's grave, just as he had said he wanted while still alive. That image, raw and heartbreaking, became the symbol of a love destroyed by the very world they inhabited. Yet the questions remain. If there truly was a third person in the room the night Nancy died, why was that presence never mentioned in the official record? And could that crumpled piece of paper hold the key to an entirely different story? Those secrets, like the shadows that linger over the Chelsea Hotel, have never left that room, and perhaps never will. Conclusion: Sid Vicious, death by self-destruction or murder? Today, the Chelsea Hotel is a different place. The walls are freshly painted, the hallways brighter, and the rooms that once reeked of cigarette smoke now welcome tourists. But for those who know the story, it remains a scar. Not only because Nancy died there, but because of how both Sid and Nancy were turned into symbols of something they never truly controlled. Sid Vicious is remembered not for masterful bass technique, but for the ferocity he brought to the stage, the very thing punk rock demanded, and the very thing that consumed him. The photographs of him in a leather jacket, eyes narrowed, mouth curled into a half smile, have become iconic, yet few have seen those same eyes when the lights went out. when his hand still clutched that crumpled piece of paper, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to life. Many see Sid and Nancy as the punk version of Romeo and Juliet, a love story built on self-destruction. Others believe it was a tragedy deliberately magnified, a narrative that the media and those around them kept alive because it sold papers, sold records, and kept the legend breathing. If there truly was a third person in that room, then the truth was buried with Sid. If not, we are left only with fragments, a friend's account, a mysterious note, a nameless shadow. More than 4 decades later, Sid's image still lives in popular culture, on t-shirts, posters, and in films. But behind that image was a 21-year-old young man, caught in a current he never had the strength to escape. Perhaps the final question is not who killed Nancy, or was Sid innocent, but rather, without the lights, the cheers, and the people who used him, what would have been left of Sid Vicious? And would we even want to know the answer if it didn't fit the legend we've built?